They left the alien princess drifting in space, but a human wrapped her in his own oxygen suit. The galaxy had always seemed endless to her, a canvas of fire and ice where stars were born in bursts of brilliance and civilizations rose and fell like sparks in the void, yet never once had she thought she would find herself alone in that immensity, abandoned, betrayed, left to drift in the cruel silence of space as if she were no more than debris to be discarded, as if her life, her blood, her title as the heir to an empire that stretched across 50 star systems meant nothing when compared to the weight of her father's wrath. The alien princess floated now among shattered hulls and broken dreams, her gown torn and scorched, her breathing mask cracked, each hiss of escaping oxygen a countdown to oblivion, each second colder than the last, frost already forming delicate crystalline patterns across her cheeks, as though the void itself had decided to claim her beauty as its final sculpture, and though she tried to stay conscious, tried to focus on the distant glow of stars or the faint silver streaks of meteors darting through the wreckage, her body betrayed her, her limbs heavy, her lungs screaming for air that was no longer there, and her heart, once full of fire, now slowed beneath the crushing silence, but she refused to close her eyes, refused to let darkness take her, because that would mean surrender, and Serenia, daughter of the High Sovereign of the Aelori Dominion, would not allow herself to die without a fight, not after she had fought so hard to live by her own convictions, not after she had dared to say no when her father commanded her to order the destruction of an undefended human colony. The faces of those colonists still haunted her, children playing in the dirt, farmers tending their crops beneath a fragile dome, men and women whose only crime was existing on land claimed by her people. And when her father demanded she sign the order to obliterate them, she had torn the document apart before his eyes, a single act of defiance that shattered her status as heir and sealed her doom, for mercy in the Aelori Dominion was treason, compassion a sickness, and by choosing humanity over conquest she had chosen exile, death, and dishonor, so her father had wasted no time, stripping her of her title, branding her a traitor, and ordering her dragged to the hangar where her attendants, once loyal, once adoring, had coldly strapped her into a cracked old mask and shoved her out of an airlock like refuse, letting her drift among the ruins of the battle she had refused to continue, and though part of her had expected a final moment of hesitation from them, some flicker of loyalty or sorrow, she had seen none, only cold eyes and sealed lips, as if they had already erased her name from memory, leaving her utterly, devastatingly alone in the void. But just as her vision began to dim, a spark of movement appeared on the horizon, a small vessel cutting across the field of wreckage, its thrusters glowing faintly against the starfield, and though she tried to dismiss it as a hallucination born of suffocation, the light grew larger, closer, until she could see the outline of a human patrol craft, modest in size compared to the dreadnoughts she had known, but fast, agile, built for survival rather than dominance, and inside, Lieutenant James Arden sat strapped in the pilot's chair, his face pale from exhaustion, his jaw shadowed with the rough stubble of a man who had not slept in days, his eyes sharp as he scanned the debris field for survivors, because even though war had hardened him, even though he had lost friends, comrades, and family to the cruelty of the Dominion, something inside him refused to let him pass a battlefield without searching, without hoping that someone, anyone, could still be saved, and when his sensors flickered with a faint life reading, he cursed under his breath, muttering that it was probably just a glitch, yet still he angled his ship toward it because duty and heart demanded he look, and when his external cameras locked onto the drifting figure of Serenia, his stomach clenched, because he recognized her kind instantly, the angular grace of her features, the faint shimmer of iridescence in her skin, the trailing fabric of her royal gown. She was Aelori, the enemy, the very species that had scorched his homeworld skies and buried his brother beneath rubble, and yet instead of anger, he felt something else rise in him, something unexpected, something that made his chest ache. She looked so fragile out there, so utterly alone, and though every training protocol screamed at him to leave her, to let her die as her people had let so many of his die, his hand was already moving, activating the airlock, suiting up, tethering himself with a cord, because James Arden had spent his life in a war where cruelty was the only language spoken, and he had decided long ago that if he lost his humanity in the process, then the enemy had already won, so he launched into the void, the cold immediately gnawing at his bones, his breath sharp inside the helmet, his body driven forward by the thrusters strapped to his suit, and as he reached her, he saw her eyes flicker open, faint light struggling to remain in them, her lips moving with words he could not hear but understood nonetheless. A plea not for mercy, not for survival, but for something more desperate, the simple will not to be alone in death, and without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, feeling the chill of her skin through the suit, and in that instant, he knew he could not let her go, could not let her life be extinguished like the millions of lights already gone from this war, so he did the unthinkable, the reckless, the selfless. He unclasped his helmet, his lungs searing as the vacuum bit into him, frost forming instantly on his skin, and he forced the helmet over her head, sealing it to her cracked mask, his last breath pouring into her as oxygen filled her starving lungs, and though the cold tore at his flesh, though stars spun around him in dizzying spirals, he clung to her, tethered by the cord to his ship, tethered by something far stronger to her survival, and just before his vision faded, he heard it. Her gasp, her body jerking with the shock of breath returning, her chest rising once more, and though he knew darkness was coming for him, he smiled, because saving her was worth the pain, worth the risk, worth even the end of himself, and together they drifted back toward the airlock, two enemies bound now not by war, but by one shared breath of life. The medbay of the patrol ship smelled faintly of sterilized steel and recycled air, its narrow chamber lit by strips of pale light that flickered every few seconds as if the vessel itself were struggling to stay alive, and in that space two beings, once enemies, now lay on parallel cots separated by nothing more than a thin aisle and the unspoken weight of survival. James' ardent skin was blistered and pale from frostburn, his breath shallow, every rise and fall of his chest a fight against the void that had bitten into him when he removed his helmet, while Serena, the alien princess who should have been his executioner by right of war, stirred weakly under the glow of the monitors, her body wrapped in emergency blankets, her luminous eyes flickering open to the strange sight of a human ship's ceiling above her, confusion clouding her thoughts before memory rushed in like a tide, the airlock, the suffocating darkness, the sudden rush of breath that had not been her own, and the face of a human who had given her oxygen at the cost of his own life, a man whose name she did not yet know, yet whose selfless act bound her fate to his in ways she could not untangle. Her first instinct was to sit up, but weakness pressed her down again, and it was only when her gaze drifted to the other cot that she saw him, his face pale but his eyes half open, watching her not with hatred but with exhaustion, suspicion, and something deeper, an unwillingness to see her die. And though she had spent her life told that humans were savages, brutes who could never understand honor or compassion, here was one who had proven her entire empire wrong with a single act. For long moments they simply stared at each other, two survivors in a ship too small to hide from truth, their silence filled only by the soft beeping of life support machines, until Serena, forcing strength into her trembling hand, reached across the narrow gap and brushed his wrist as if to confirm he was real, her voice soft, broken by the translation barrier, whispering her name, Serena, and James, after a pause, rasped out his own through cracked lips, James. Each syllable weighted not as an introduction between enemies but as an acknowledgement of something fragile and human, or perhaps more than human, that tied them together now. In the days that followed, silence gave way to halting communication, at first gestures and looks. Then through the help of a battered translation module James had dug out from storage, their words broken, clumsy, but carrying meaning nonetheless, and with each exchange the walls of suspicion thinned, replaced by a wary respect that slowly grew into something warmer. Serena told him how she had been cast out, branded a traitor for refusing to order the slaughter of innocents, her voice trembling with the memory of being shoved from the hangar like discarded trash, and James listened, torn between the memories of his own people suffering at her empire's hands and the undeniable truth in her eyes that she had chosen a different path, one that cost her everything. In return, he spoke of earth, of green fields turned to ash, of brothers buried under rubble, of the endless fatigue of fighting a war that seemed destined never to end. And though the weight of grief sat heavy on them both, there was solace too in sharing it, solace in knowing that they were no longer alone in bearing the burdens of choices they had not asked for. Practical necessity bound them even tighter, for the patrol ship had taken damage in the battle whose wreckage still lingered outside, and repairs demanded both of them, human and alien hands working side by side to weld fractured panels, reroute power conduits, patch life support leaks, Serena surprising James with her knowledge of Dominion technology that even he, a trained officer, could barely comprehend, while he in turn taught her the tactile patience of human engineering, of doing more with less. And somewhere amid the sparks of tools and the hum of consoles, they began to laugh, quietly at first like strangers testing forbidden ground, then louder, freer, until the medbay that had once felt like a tomb began to feel like something else entirely, a fragile sanctuary carved out of the vast cruelty of the stars. But every fragile moment carried the shadow of danger. For James knew harboring an enemy princess, even one abandoned by her own, would be considered treason of the highest order by Earth command, punishable by death, and Serena knew that if her father's forces found her, No mercy would be shown, not to her and not to the human who dared protect her. Yet when the subject arose between them, when fear pressed its weight upon their conversations, James only shook his head and said in a voice hoarse but steady, "I've already given you my oxygen, Serenia. I'm not taking it back." And though the words were simple, she understood the vow beneath them, understood that he had tethered himself to her survival not out of duty but choice, and choice in a galaxy of chains was rarer than gold. Yet peace never lingers in wartime, and it was on the fifth day as they sat in the cockpit rerouting navigation systems, their hands brushing in ways neither pulled away from, that the radar pinged with a sound so cold it silenced them both, a massive object. Entering proximity, its signature unmistakable to Serenia's eyes the moment she saw it, her breath catching in her throat as she whispered, "Dreadnought," the word dripping with both fear and recognition because this was no ordinary vessel, this was her father's flagship, the very ship from which she had been cast into the void, its presence here no coincidence, its sensors no doubt sweeping for any trace of her, and James's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively reaching for the throttle. Though he knew his ship stood no chance against the Leviathan outside, and when the comms crackled to life with a booming voice demanding surrender of the traitor princess, Serenia's hands shook, her instincts screaming at her to run, to hide, to beg James to give her up before he was destroyed for her sake. But when she turned to him, ready to plead, she saw only resolve in his eyes, hard and unyielding, and his hand, calloused and scarred, reached out to hers, squeezing with a promise spoken. Not in words but in the pressure of his grip, a promise that he would not abandon her, that he had already chosen his side, and it was not empire or command but her. Her throat tightened as tears welled, because no one in her life had ever stood beside her in defiance of fate, no one had ever said with such quiet certainty, "You're not theirs anymore. You're with me," and though the dreadnought's shadow loomed closer, though the patrol craft rattled as fighters deployed like a swarm of wasps from its hangars, for the first time in her life Serenia felt something that had always been denied her. Not the cold authority of power, not the brittle mask of duty, but belonging, fragile yet burning bright, belonging not to an empire but to a single human who had chosen her over the stars themselves, and in that fragile cockpit, under the shadow of war's greatest machine, two hands clasped tighter, bracing not as enemies but as allies, ready to face whatever storm was coming together. The silence of space was heavier than any battlefield the human soldier had endured, and yet in that silence, wrapped together in the thin bubble of life that his oxygen suit still offered, the alien princess breathed against him, each fragile inhale a reminder of how close they had come to death and how close they still remained to it, because their suit was a makeshift salvation, leaking pressure, struggling against the void, and the soldier knew it was not a permanent solution but only a brief stay of execution. His mind raced with the cold mathematics of survival, oxygen reserves dwindling, suit power draining, beacon signal weak, but every time he glanced at the alien princess, her translucent skin glowing faintly under the dim light of distant stars, her eyes half closed yet stubbornly focused on him, he felt that calculation shift, his every instinct screaming that her survival outweighed his, that if one life had to end in this vacuum it would be his and not hers, because he had chosen long ago in that split second when he threw his suit around her drifting body that she was the reason he still breathed, the reason his hands still clenched instead of surrendering to the endless cold. She stirred slightly, her voice barely audible, a whisper brushing against the inside of the helmet as if her words themselves were fragile enough to shatter. Why would you give me this?" she asked, her eyes filled with something more piercing than gratitude, something between sorrow and awe. The soldier swallowed hard, knowing that explanations in moments like these were useless but also knowing that silence would be a cruelty. "Because they left you," he said, voice low but steady. "But I won't. Not while I can still fight. Not while I can still breathe. You are not a thing to be discarded. You are a life worth more than all the empires that abandoned you." She blinked, tears forming despite the impossibility of moisture in such an environment, and yet they formed because her species adapted differently, tears that crystallized into shimmering motes before vanishing into the suit's limited air, and she closed her hand around his as if anchoring herself not to the suit, not to survival, but to him. Time stretched in cruel silence, each second a hammer striking the thin glass of their survival. The soldier monitored the reserve tank, the figures ticking down, and he knew they had maybe an hour, two at most, before oxygen failed. His beacon still pulsed a weak distress signal, but he had no guarantee that anyone loyal would hear it. Most likely those who would come first were enemies, scavengers, or worse, the same faction that had cast her into the void as punishment or betrayal. He forced himself to steady his breathing, each inhale rationed, each exhale measured because he could not afford waste. The alien princess, weak as she was, noticed his deliberate control and understood without words, mimicking him, her chest rising and falling slower, her instincts and will aligning with his. In that shared rhythm, they became more than just two bodies pressed into the fragile cocoon of survival. They became one will, one pulse, one defiance against the universe. The soldier closed his eyes briefly, imagining rescue, imagining docking hatches opening, imagining fresh air and warmth flooding in, but he did not allow himself to cling to hope that could crush him. Instead, he remembered battlefields, the screams of comrades, the faces of the forgotten, and he realized something profound, that all the wars he had fought had been for orders, for politics, for faceless rulers, but this moment, this desperate, fragile, trembling moment, was the first war he fought truly for love. It was raw, unshaped, perhaps not even acknowledged fully by her, but he knew with absolute clarity that this was what it meant to be alive, to choose someone else's heartbeat over your own. A flicker interrupted the void, the faint spark of light, a glimmer on the horizon of blackness. The soldier stiffened, adjusting the cracked interface on his wrist display, amplifying the signal, and there it was. A ship, not far, burning faint thrusters. His chest tightened. It could be salvation, it could be death. The alien princess followed his gaze, her lips parting, her strength barely allowing her to whisper, It's one of mine." Her words carried both hope and dread, because if it was one of hers, then it belonged to the empire that had condemned her, and their intentions could be as sharp as blades. The soldier tightened his hold on her hand, his decision already made. If they tried to take her, if they tried to finish what they started, then he would not let her go, not even if it meant tearing the last fragments of his suit apart. The ship grew closer, its outline sharp against the stars, sleek and alien, its hull shimmering with strange energy. He triggered the beacon flare, releasing the last of his suit's emergency power in a final burst, a desperate call that painted them in light against the void. The ship slowed, adjusting its trajectory, and then a docking claw extended, mechanical and cold, locking around their fragile bubble of existence. The soldier braced, every muscle coiled, shielding the alien princess with his own body as if to take the brunt of whatever came next. The airlock sealed, pressure shifted, and with a hiss, breathable atmosphere returned. The soldier tore off the helmet, gasping, eyes darting as alien figures appeared, their armor gleaming, their faces unreadable. One stepped forward, eyes narrowing at the sight of the princess. "She was meant to be gone," the alien voice said, cold and sharp. But before they could move further, the princess, weak yet radiant, lifted her head and spoke with a voice that carried across the chamber despite her frailty. "I was meant to be forgotten," she said, her gaze fierce, "but he would not let me." Silence fell. Even her people, who had condemned her, hesitated under the weight of her words, because there was no denying the sight before them. The human soldier, half broken, bruised, giving everything he had to keep her alive, holding her as if she was the only truth in the universe. The soldier stepped forward, defiance in every line of his battered frame. "If you want her dead, you'll have to kill me too," he said, voice like steel. "But know this, I will never stop fighting for her." For a long, tense moment, no one moved, the weight of decision suspended in the airlock. And then, slowly, one by one, the alien guards lowered their weapons, not out of loyalty to the princess perhaps, but out of something deeper. A recognition that what they were witnessing was larger than duty, larger than politics, larger than even survival. It was love, naked and undeniable, and it carried more power than any empire's decree. The princess collapsed against him, exhausted but alive, her voice soft as she whispered, "You gave me your breath, and now you've given me my name back." The soldier held her close, his heart steady, his resolve unbroken. Around them, the ship hummed, carrying them away from the void, carrying them toward an uncertain future, but one thing was certain. The galaxy would never forget this moment, the moment a discarded princess and a human soldier rewrote destiny together, not with crowns or battles, but with the unbreakable defiance of love. And as the stars wheeled around them, he knew with unshakable certainty that he would do it all again. Not for glory, not for reward, but simply because she was worth every breath he had left.